Hey Wonderfuls! I finally installed a solar system on my van. When I started looking into solar installs and systems, it was super intimidating, but it's actually not that bad and pretty simple if you're just doing a basic one panel system like myself. It basically goes solar panel, disconnect switch, solar controller, fuse, battery. This is a Renogy 100 watt solar starter kit. And a huge thank you to my sweetheart for sending the solar system and surprising me with it. So I already had a roof rack on my van, which is actually a ladder rack that I had repurposed for my hockey stick and tarp awning that I have another video about. I'll link in the description. So I had to modify the existing rack slightly in order to make the solar panel fit. Because the existing roof rack was just a little bit longer than the solar panel itself, I took some C-channel to span the roof rack and bolted it across and then bolted the solar panel to that. I made a template with cardboard to make sure I had all the holes in the right spots, and then I just used painter's tape to hold the bolts in place in the solar panel while I lifted it onto the rack. And eventually I had a slightly crooked but mounted solar panel. I ran the cables from the solar panel through the roof of the van, and in order to make a watertight seal, I used a solar cable gland, which is this little cover that can be sealed right to the roof. I drilled a small hole that the wires fit through and painted the exposed metal. Then I put the wires through the gland and ran them through the roof. I identified one with blue tape on both ends so that I would know which was positive and which was negative. Turns out though that I got it wrong, and the cable with the red on it is not the positive, so I ended up having to swap the cables around on the solar controller before I actually plugged the panel in the wrong way. I used some construction adhesive to fasten the gland to the roof so I didn't actually put any extra holes or screws in the flange, and then I left that overnight with a weight on it. My weight was just a bag of screws, but it held it in place until the adhesive cured. I got the idea from the Broken Nomad, who got the idea from Sarah Rose to use Flex Seal on the outer sealing of the flange instead of silicone. So I taped it off to try and make it a little bit neater before I gobbed it on there quite excessively. And I did this in a couple of layers. I left the cables on the rooftop disconnected between the solar panel and the van. And this is because it's very, very important to connect the solar controller to the battery before you connect the solar controller to the panels. Otherwise, you could fry your controller. Once everything on the rooftop was done, except for the final cable connectors, I started wiring in the control panel. So I located it behind the driver's seat where it would be out of the way and have room for air to circulate. I do have a line of sight to it, but it is not in the most accessible location. Once I mounted my controller in the most awkward place possible, I started connecting the wires from the roof since they weren't yet hooked up to the solar panel. Between the solar panel and the solar controller on the positive wire, I used a disconnect switch, just a cheap battery on-off switch that I found at Princess Auto. The important thing is that the switch has the appropriate amperage for your solar system. Next, I hooked the cables from the solar controller to the battery. And again, on the positive wire between the two, I put a fuse. And I checked the manufacturer's specs for this solar controller and panel, and it called for a 10 amp fuse. After I made my connections to the battery on the positive and negative side, the controller had power and started showing me readings on the battery level, that it was getting 0 amps input and showing 15 for the mode. This is when I went up to the roof and discovered that I had marked the negative wire with the blue tape rather than the positive. Why in the fuck? So I went back down and swapped out the wire going into the switch and then hooked the negative into its appropriate place on the controller. And once I was 100% positive that the battery was hooked up, and the cables going through the roof were properly hooked up, I went back up top and put together the 2 final cable connections. I went back to the solar controller, and because the disconnect switch was turned off, no readings were showing up on it just yet. And as soon as I switched that to on, the battery started charging and I started seeing how many amps were coming into the system. I'm told these panels are hail resistant, but I also live in Alberta, so I think I would like to make some sort of an emergency cover just to kind of cushion them, but I imagine the van's rubber floor mats would work in a pinch. Because of the way I used my existing roof rack, there's a nice angle on the solar panel, which does work very well for this part of the country. I'll eventually utilize the hinged part of the ladder rack even better and make the solar panel have an adjustable tilt so that I can tilt it in the opposite direction and still catch the sun even if it happens to be on the other side of the van.